Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on new approaches in patient recruitment for clinical trials. I'm Andrew Armando, Chief Strategy Officer of LifeSci Communications, and it's my honor to moderate this session today with an esteemed panel of experts that I'll introduce in a moment. But first, a few comments as a lead-in to our discussion. There's no shortage of challenges facing sponsors, contract research organizations, and academic institutions involved in the conduct of clinical trials today. And while COVID-19 certainly has exacerbated many of those issues, they existed long before the advent of the pandemic. One of the most enduring and complex of those hurdles is effective, efficient recruitment of patients for clinical research studies. Over 85% of clinical trials are delayed or discontinued. Patient enrollment failures are often the cause. Despite research indicating that over 90% of Americans agree that clinical trials are important to improving health, and more than 80% are willing to participate in studies, fewer than 10% actually do. Further, physicians directly refer less than 1% of their patients to clinical studies. Today, we will discuss root causes of recruitment challenges and how pharma companies and leading service providers are rising to meet them with novel solutions. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts who bring a wealth of experience and broad perspectives to the table today. We're really pleased to have them. First up, Renee Creo is Director of Site Management at Bayer Pharmaceuticals in the US. Study startup strategy and execution are two areas of focus in Renee's role at Bayer, or Bayer, depending on how you pronounce it. Renee has over 23 years of broad-based experience in drug development, and prior to joining Bayer, she spent about 20 years in multiple leadership positions across a range of functions at two leading global CROs, Covance and PRA Health Sciences. Renee, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be here.
Next up is Stephanie Kuehner. Stephanie serves as Global Director for Clinical Technology and Patient Recruitment within Strategic Sourcing and Procurement at Bristol Myers Squibb. Stephanie has 20 years of clinical operations experience, and prior to joining BMS, Stephanie built and led AI Cure's commercial group in the medication adherence and digital biomarkers markets. She also spent 14 years in patient recruitment and engagement with Accurian. Stephanie, great to have you.
Thank you, Andrew.
And finally, Jessica Snyder is Director of Social and Digital Media at LifeSci Communications. Jessica has nearly 10 years of industry experience executing integrated social and digital media campaigns for biopharma, medtech, and healthcare companies. Prior to joining LifeSci, she was Associate Director of Social Media at InTouch Solutions, where she helped successfully pioneer the use of social media for clinical trial recruitment and engagement for an oncology unit of a top 10 global pharmaceutical company. Jessica, it's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, with that, let's jump right into our discussion. And what we'd like to do in terms of the flow of our conversation today is build upon the initial comments in terms of identifying or reaffirming the importance of patient recruitment as part of the clinical trial process, to take a deeper dive into some of the challenges that all of you observe in the conduct of those studies, and then talk about some of the methods that are common in the industry today, and just get your opinions and assessments of those as we go along, and then we'll just take it from there. So with that, how essential is effective patient recruitment to the ability of sponsors to accelerate the pace at which new medicines are developed and launched? Steph, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. And I think, in the beginning in your introduction, Andrew, you alluded to this, but patient recruitment is one, if not the biggest barrier to getting drugs to market in a timely manner. And I'm sure the panelists would agree with that. The protocols are not getting any easier by any means. In fact, more complicated. And the days of running a trial where we were looking for, a straightforward high cholesterol patient, for example, are way behind us. Sadly, they don't exist anymore. But it's never been, with that said, a better time and or more important to plan for a robust recruitment strategy up front, which, and we'll talk about this a bit today, will include a whole mix of approaches. And when proactively planning an effective recruitment strategy, you really increase the risk of not only simply meeting the original timelines, which in itself is a tough task, but pushing to accelerate them. I have seen too many times in the last 20 years where vendors were engaged 3 to 6 months, at post study, 3 to 6 months at the end of study closure. And really that puts us in a situation where we're in a rescue mode versus planning proactively. Now, if I flip that, and if we would have planned proactively 3 to 6 months of a campaign in the beginning, we could have saved months at the end of the campaign, accelerating, first of all, not only completing earlier, but accelerating the opportunity to get that drug to market and that drug into patient hands. And really, I challenge this group, because it's really important, to look at what the total average monthly cost all in would be to run your trial, and really compare that to the cost of executing an effective, and effective is really important here, results-based recruitment plan, to see whether, first of all, there is a cost savings associated with this acceleration, but even if it's a financial break even, it's a win-win due to the time saved overall for the drug. So that's just, I think it's something that we all really need to think about and plan for.
No, that makes perfect sense. And in terms of results and operational excellence that feeds that results, Renee, that's right in your wheelhouse in terms of what you do at Bayer. What are your thoughts in terms of the importance, how essential patient recruitment is to not just the clinical trial process, but accelerating it so we can get more important new medicines to the market?
Yeah, it's so important to invest early, because you really, and the data will show that you invest less money if you start earlier. And one of the important things that we've started doing is starting to think about patient recruitment when we're doing protocol feasibility. That soon, before we even have a go for the different countries, et cetera, we start planning what does our patient demographic look like, how do we want to reach these patients, and then taking it even further to say, how can we make this potential protocol that's coming, even though it's only in a synopsis form at this point, easier on the patients. Maybe we look at decentralizing some of that a little bit. So maybe they don't have to go to the office for every single visit. Perhaps if it's just a blood draw in between or something, maybe they can go to a local central lab where we can utilize and make it easier on the patients. Things like that. Sending out home health aides to the houses. Let the nurses go to the patient, because I think we miss out on a lot of patients because of their proximity to where these studies are being run and their abilities to get to the doctors. So not only is it difficult for us sometimes to reach the patients, to get them to want to buy in and participate in the clinical trial, but once they do, when they see what the commitment is, although they want to participate, sometimes it could be a financial burden on them from a travel perspective, and there's been a ton of things that have come out recently to help with that, things like partnering with an Uber or something like that to get patients back and forth. They get different debit type cards to give them their patient reimbursements on to make it easier for them. But all of that planning and thought needs to go in. I mean, as early as possible at the protocol planning phases. So you're going through that. So as you're building your study budget, you have that built in. And then when it trickles down, you know, one of the other things that we do is negotiating the site level budgets, making sure that the sites have the right monies. Does it make sense to have, you know, a study level campaign to find patients? Or is it better to provide the funds to the sites and allow them, because they know their demographic better than we do? So I think we're getting better in our organizations collectively in listening to the sites and letting them guide us on what the patient looks like versus us always telling them, and really actively listening to them and trying to, instead of having a one size fits all, make more like a buffet where, okay, if you're interested in the, you know, we have these materials ready, you can utilize. You're not interested, okay, what can we do to support you? Tell us how we can take the burden off of you. And my hands are going already, Andrew. I can't help it.
I think, you know, totally agree with that. And one thing that I would also recommend is that when you're at that protocol feasibility stage, I think that's a great time to really dive deep into your target demographics too. What are they doing online? What are they doing in their normal day-to-day lives that you can potentially reach them and help inform them about the clinical trial to ultimately, you know, positively impact their health too. But when we're working with a lot of clients, if they bring us on early enough, which we always hope that they do, you know, it's great to do a lot of social listening research and market research to really understand those target audiences, and not just the patients. It could be caregivers, healthcare professionals who are pulling people into the study, and understanding their behaviors and habits so you can make it as easy as possible for them to get the information that they need to make a decision.
Totally agree. You're gonna utilize completely different tools for a postmenopausal study than you would for you know, going after a younger population. It absolutely makes a difference.
I want to build on some of those themes that all of you touched on as we were addressing sort of how essential patient recruitment is to acceleration. Intertwined in all of your responses to different degrees were some of the challenges that come into play as well. And I really want to make sure that our audience, that we clearly articulate and that we build on some of those. Steph, I want to come back to you. Talk about some of the biggest obstacles that come into play. At the outset, I talked about that huge statistical disconnect between the number of Americans that claim to be interested and understand the importance of clinical research, but such a small percentage actually do, and even an even smaller percentage of physicians recommend. So there has to be some hurdles, some obstacles in the way. What, in your considerable experience, have you seen some of those to be?
Yes, and you've definitely touched upon, again, some of them, but you know, honestly, it does vary by therapeutic area, indication, and even at a country level, right? So there's that whole aspect to take into consideration. But I think, you know, overall, there are a few, and there go my hands, there are a few common themes that I think we see. And one is obviously the complexity of the study protocols. The easy ones, again, do not exist. And, you know, trying to find a patient that meets, you know, ABC criteria but doesn't have XYZ is very challenging. You know, to find that needle in a haystack can certainly present not only challenges to patient recruitment, you know, initiatives that are being done, you know, centrally to support the study, but also at a site level, right? Do they have the resources to ultimately be able to find the subjects, not only within their practice, but also within their community? So I think, you know, those are two key things. Lack of awareness about clinical trials is also something that's a big challenge. Although I caveat that right now with, you know, fortunately and unfortunately, with everything happening with COVID, you know, the media and the coverage right now around that is bringing a lot of awareness to clinical trials in general. So I think that can only help us as an industry, certainly. We talked about resourcing at the site level, certainly. And then I think there's also this fear from a patient perspective around, a serious adverse event and a fear of having study procedures and side effects. So I just think that also creates this bubble of all together, kind of mixes together to create a challenging environment to really find subjects.
All of those make perfect sense. And Renee, when I was running a small biotech company and we were running some different oncology-focused clinical studies, I was so focused, and our team was so focused on being concerned about the complexity of the protocol, like the needle in the haystack. But then once we sort of worked our way through those issues, there was a whole suite of additional sort of pragmatic operational issues that in your role, I'm sure you face. You touched on logistical challenges, just simply a patient is 120 miles away from a site where they have to do their monitoring visits, and that becomes an issue. Is there a telehealth component involved? Is there a patient diary involved? All of those things that you thought would sort of fall into place don't necessarily fall into place with human beings. So maybe you could talk a little bit more to those types of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. They keep me up at night on most trials, if not all. And it is a lot of moving pieces. And that's where the process really is so important. And, we're fortunate over the years with the technologies that have come forward and things like that we've gotten better at it. But I think about when you finally do get that patient to come in for a screening visit and you go through all these things and some of these protocols are so complex, and then you have 2 and 3 informed consents sometimes, right? And you're dropping these 20-page documents in their lap, and you're free to ask questions, but it could be intimidating for them on the patient side. But internally, here we are juggling. We're trying to build site binders to train the sites at the same time as we're trying to manage a budget to see how much budget do we have for the patients. We're focused on that first patient, first visit, right? Everybody wants to get the first patient in, and everyone's so laser focused on that. And I'm always the one in the room raising my hand saying, well, what about patient 2 through 10, right? Because when you get your first one, the clock starts. You need to get your last one in time as well, and you have to make sure you're getting them in between. So trying to manage all of that, it's the quality of the patient, and trying to convince the principal investigator to network with his own colleagues, which can be dicey conversations sometimes. They don't always want to involve everyone, and because then different opinions come in, but trying to help them understand that if you allow these other physicians and clinics to feed patients into you for this clinical trial, it's just going to be that much better. And honestly, internally, I think we're always running in circles. No matter how hard we try and how many processes we put in place, there's always something that arises, something that comes back from the IRB that we need to manage, and getting all of the materials to get the patients in through the IRB in time. It all very much has to fall into play, and it's quite challenging for the teams because everyone is trying to work together to move something forward, but we have to keep in the forefront of our minds the burden on the site as well as the patients, and trying to get the patients in an ethical way and making sure that they're comfortable and understand what they're signing up for.
That's so well said. That's another factor that comes into play where you feel like you have all the puzzle pieces together, but then you realize that the sites that you've so carefully worked to select,
right,
strangely enough, they also treat patients.
Yeah.
And they have other clinical studies
that
they're executing as well. And you're not the only game in town, even though you're so laser focused on it. So those are very well articulated. So I want to segue from the importance and the challenges with recruitment to the methods that are used today. Obviously a few that come to mind right away are sort of traditional media, TV, radio, print. Obviously, we'll certainly talk more about social and digital, but there's certainly no shortage of methods. So what I'd like to hear from the group, and Renee, let me bounce back to you real quick to start, and then Jess, I want to go to you. What are we seeing in the marketplace? What's Bayer doing? Without crossing any lines. What do we see in terms of, collegial? We know pharma is the biggest small industry in the world, so everyone talks to each other. What's going on out there?
So yeah, it's a great question. And, gone are the days where we used to, I remember when I first got into business, they had the flyers with the little phone numbers on the bottom they would pull off to be able to call the investigator. You would hang them in the elevators at the hospitals. Do you have a dry cough? Take this number and call us in the morning, kind of thing. So not so much of that. We do still see flyers, and we do still see postings and posters and such like that. We see a lot of we do still see some telephone ads. I don't see as many phone bank type things where we have those cold callings as we did back in the day. I don't think that got to the right patient demographic. A lot of, and I'm sure, Jessica will go into this even more later, a lot of targeted internet type searches and advertisements to talk about, looking at what patient demographic you have and deciding what the right type of internet presence works for that. Is it something like this, where you set up what we call lunch and learns, and you open it up to the public and you just talk about something maybe around women's health? Are you having, problem periods and things like that? And you talk about it, from the science perspective. You're not trying to convince anybody of anything, but you talk about it from just to get that education out there in those therapeutic areas that are important to your book of business, so to speak. And you make sure that you're constantly doing that on a global level. If you're only speaking about the medical condition, you're not running into any IRB issues or anything like that, and you just have these things. They can dial in, they can phone into a video, or you set up somewhere at a church or something, and you do these things to just continually socialize the idea of, yes, there are different areas that people are having problems with, and yes, there are answers that we're looking to get to, and with the help of patients, we can then get to that. And then, working in those areas with those physicians who choose to participate in the programs. I think another thing that is newer for me that I've seen probably in the past 8 to 10 years maybe is looking at lab data. We have all of these lab values that we need for our inclusion criteria in a blinded manner. There's ways to evaluate lab data to see where the populations exist. There will be certain areas in certain states you'll see more prevalent disease than you will in others. So by looking at that, you're not getting down to a patient name or address or contact information or even a physician who ordered the lab. You're only looking specifically at what part of the world do I see this most at? And that's where I'm going to spend my most of my money, and I'm going to intensely look there. And then I'm going to spread out from there, maybe with a little bit of lesser things in between. But that's a key that I think took us as an industry, when I say us as an industry, a while to get to. How do you ensure that you're not violating any confidentiality and HIPAA and all those other good things, but still being able to get us to the next right thing and trying to make more people feel better and do better in the diseases that they're battling.
So speaking of de-identified aggregated data, Jess, when you think about using digital platforms, talk a little bit about those methodologies at a high level. And if you could start off with maybe a little bit of commentary on these online communities. I know, there's more, not just on, one platform or another, but maybe, dedicated providers that are just setting up sort of these very intuitive ways to search for a clinical study. You talk about that and then take it in any direction that you want in terms of other methods.
Sure, yeah. So obviously my expertise lies in social and digital clinical recruitment, and especially over the past few months, we've seen those mediums become really popular, and a lot of companies have reached out to us because they aren't able to send, reps into doctors' offices to inform physicians about a trial. So we're having to do a lot of online interaction in all aspects of our lives, and that also carries through to clinical trial recruitment, which I think is a good thing for the industry because there are so many opportunities to reach highly qualified patients who are, desperately looking for information and a potential treatment for their health, and serving it up to them in a place where they're already interacting. So, we see people on social media channels or on forums and blogs asking questions about, I was diagnosed with breast cancer yesterday. What do I do next? And, that's a very crazy time in a patient's life. And so they are able to really find the information that they need. And then as service providers and as companies, we can be there with with a very thoughtful message and the right mediums to give them the information that they're looking for. And, we've seen a lot of success doing that on social and digital channels.
Steph, what have you seen?
Okay, I was muted, sorry. No, so, I do agree certainly with Renee too. I mean, the days again of I'm not saying the big media campaigns, radio, TV, print aren't effective by any means, but I just feel like they're not as commonly used. And it used to be that we see, the typical campaign mediums, 5-10 years ago, but then sprinkled in with this digital social media to maybe recruit 20%. But in actuality, I found that social media and digital methods have really been the most cost-effective manner to drive patients. And it used to be that the volume of subjects wasn't necessarily as great, and we needed to really heavily rely on the traditional methods, but that's shifting now. And I think, as we're, as we have access really to more sophisticated tools in marketing, such as predictive modeling, for example, we're able to recruit, I'm thinking like, for example, say we're recruiting for a BPH or an enlarged prostate study. We can go to advocacy groups or interest groups, but perhaps we can now, target online and place ads and try to reach or get, increase the number of hits that we're going to get by looking at like antique car shows, for example, or groups online that would be most motivated and targeted to really drive that right patient for us. And we don't have to necessarily just do a big Google ad or a big Facebook ad, but keeping it so targeted to really the right community.
And I think those digital tools really help with patient privacy too. If there's a clinical trial that is, or if someone has a disease that's maybe a little bit embarrassing, if you, see an ad on your Facebook page and it takes you to a website where you fill out a form to get more information, you don't have to go anywhere for that. And you can answer questions and fill out information in the privacy of your own home and really get all of that information you need to make the right decision for your health. So we've seen a lot of success in trials or for disease states that might be a little bit more sensitive in nature in general.
Yeah. So it seems clear to me, not just from your commentary, but looking at a number of different secondary research studies leading up to this conversation today. A few of them polled a sort of a suite of pharma companies and service providers totaling about 150 survey participants. And it might interest or it might reinforce what you've all said to hear that the largest percentage that was allocated to a particular methodology was to social and digital. 60% of those said that they use social and digital as a key part of their campaign. Next, obviously, was traditional media, but it was about 40%. Now, unscientifically, I think 2 or 3 years ago, at minimum, that would be flipped, and probably even more so slanted towards traditional media as we were sort of getting our arms around how granular and sophisticated the algorithms and analytics can be when it comes to social and digital media. So I want to dig into that a little bit more, because we've also talked a little bit about, we've sprinkled in some different types of disease states. And there's a few that I want to drill down on a little bit more that seem very prevalent in our industry today. And no, I'm going to put aside COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines, because I think we're going to have plenty of discussion on that. So I want to talk about immuno-oncology therapies, gene therapies, and rare diseases, not necessarily in that order. So sort of noodle that, and, Steph, I'll sort of start with you. What do you see in particular with one or more of those? If there's any one that you're more comfortable with than others, and just focus on that. If you want to broad base it, that's fine. But in particular, when it comes to the different methodologies that are being used for patient recruitment, we still see social and digital, or because of sort of a more novel, modern approach. Is that being used more for those, or is it still a mix? What are you seeing with those kind of programs?
Yeah, so there we would certainly see less of the traditional media efforts that originally were described, and more of the online, social, digital avenues for sure. I do think when you're talking about that select group as a whole, I think we really now need to look at awareness and education, and really what's within their community or their referral networks. And I know referral networks historically they haven't always been successful for various reasons, many of which, a doctor doesn't necessarily want to give up their subject, right, or their patient to another treating physician, which I understand. But there are, we're seeing an upswing of trial matching based companies that are out there, where they can now, and a lot of them are being found either co-founded or run by actual physicians who understand the niche patient population, and having the ability, a lot of the trials that we're talking about, they aren't thousands of patients that we're looking for, but there's a smaller subset of a patient population. So having that expertise and being able to not only create that awareness, but having access to the community pools of patients is really critical. And there's some niche companies that are popping up around some of these individual disease states to try to do that and create that awareness. And I think patients are actually seeking that out in conjunction with this, which I think is really, really helpful.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. With certain disease states, you've got a voracious appetite for patients and family members as well to seek out information. Obviously, there's a sense of urgency with a number of those rare diseases. Jess, maybe you could expand on that in terms of comparing and contrasting different types of digital recruitment strategies for rare diseases like we're talking about.
Yeah, so that's a question we get a lot from our clients who come to us, is if we have one strategy that we've found works across the board, right? Like an easy plug and play. And I always say, I wish so bad. However, it really just does depend so much on the disease state, that the target audience is, how they're interacting, what their demographics are. So, you can't execute the same strategy online for a very rare disease that has 2,000 patients total like you would a big oncology program. And what we always stress is that social listening is imperative before you kick off any kind of digital campaign. Really any campaign in general, but especially if you're looking to launch a digital online presence. And so my recommendation for that is to conduct what we call a social listening report, where we're really looking at online conversations and analyzing where is that conversation happening, what's being shared online, and who's driving the conversation. And that really allows a company to figure out exactly where they need to be allocating a budget, how much they need to be spending, what platforms they need to be on. because, you know, there's some where we would recommend being on multiple platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to reach a large population. And then some of the more rare campaigns, we're able to really laser focus on one platform that we think has a great advocacy group presence or KOL presence that we can, you know, use those followers to target some very specific messages about a campaign. Renee,
your network knows no boundaries, your long and illustrious career. What kind of, if any, anecdotal comments can you share with us in terms of what you've heard from colleagues who are involved with whether it's study startup or patient engagement in particular when it comes to social and digital media recruiting, since we're talking about that? You know, positive feedback, not so sure, somewhere in between. What kinds of things are you hearing?
Well, I think in this industry, one of the harder things is when something, and the internet and social media is not new by any stretch of the imagination, but you know, we tend to move a little slower in this type of field that we work in, right? And it wasn't that long ago that the FDA finally started accepting digital signatures on things and such like that, right? When you think about it in those terms. So I think cautiously optimistic is what I would say. I think we've seen great results with social media if we spend the right amount of time, as Jessica was talking about, finding the right platform and doing it the right way, because it's not one size fits all. And then getting the buy-in from things like compliance and regulatory and everybody who legal and you know, you have all of those bodies within every organization that this is still a little bit new, and you know, the FDA and different guidelines that are out there on what you can and can't do aren't very black and white. There's a lot of gray there. So it's how is your organization going to take that and apply that and look at that and look at that, you know, look at how we're going to advertise to find these appropriate patients. So I think cautiously optimistic. I think that those who have used it, they've been successful in it if they've taken the time up front. Others who think they're just going to be able to, and I've known a few people who just think they're going to throw something up there and, you know, like a post in a chat room or something and get patients from that. That's not going to be successful. And then you have to be very careful because you don't want to burden the sites, right? Because every patient that calls in to that site that thinks they're a candidate, you know, is keeping the site away potentially. You know, we've been in situations where, you know, you just get it wrong sometimes, right? And the sites will say, we're not interested, don't send us anymore, you know, take our numbers off of that because we're spending more time on patients who are not eligible. And we're afraid we're going to miss out on those who are. So I think over time we've gotten a lot better at it. I still think we have a ways to go, but I think, you know, we're heading in the right direction. Just an acceptability in my colleagues and what they're willing to do and such.
Yeah, and one thing really quickly, Renee, you said this and it sparked something in my head, is that we were actually just on the phone with a client who has some, in all of the clinical trial protocols I've seen, some very, very intense inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, so much so that you had to see a CT scan before you were even eligible to join. And there were a lot of things, I'm not a scientist, but I work with a lot of scientists who can explain it a lot better. But we were talking to them and we were like, that is, you know, there's a lot of details there. And they said that one of their biggest challenges was the time that was spent when people would call in, that there were like 90% of a fail rate or something like that. And so there are ways to create a website or target on the back end where we're being very specific in our messaging and then also asking very detailed questions before a patient even gets pushed to the next step or gets pushed to a screener. But we see that a lot, and I think it was just a conversation we had last week, so definitely sparked an idea in my head.
So Steph, when I think about guidelines and I think about structure, I think about procurement.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in on, just to tag on a little bit to Renee's comments, because by the way, they were all 100% accurate. I cannot agree more. But Yeah, so this is where, you know, I immediately get the legal flag comes up, right? And, was the appropriate due diligence done to ensure that, ABC approach, whatever it might be, is a viable option, right? So, and then there's the whole idea around subcontracts, and have the subcontractors, gone through the due diligence process, which, by the way, is all very important. It's just hurdles that, that we need to do to protect our organizations. Absolutely. And there might have been one or two situations where I hit a roadblock, but most of the times, each of these situations can be resolved, just taking the time and the right approach to do so. Right. So I'm not saying it's a scary thing by any means, and don't be scared. But yes, it's just part of the process.
Yeah, but to Jess's point earlier, that's why it's so important to start so much earlier, because you get the, legal buy-in, and legal goes, I'm okay with it, but make sure you check with B. And then B says, oh, I think it's a check with C. And then, the clock starts ticking. And then by the time the campaign's released, you're kind of behind the 8 ball. And then it could potentially give the perception that the campaign wasn't successful, whereas it was just the red tape that we went through, which, as Stephanie said, is very important, but it's still, we need to think of ways to streamline that, or at least get engaged earlier so that it doesn't preclude us from getting the full bang for your buck, for lack of a better way of saying it, for what you're investing in.
Yeah, and I think it's really important ahead of time to make a very strategic plan that has proof behind it. So we always call it put our MLR hats on, and what are they going to ask for? What can we see about patient privacy data to ensure that we're protecting that? Because that's, of course, the number one thing that we're all thinking about. So what are we doing to protect patient privacy? What can we see? What can't we see? How are we transferring data? How are you moving information around from a service provider to a client? And those are all things that, you should be thinking about ahead of time, coming up with a plan, putting it on paper, and then giving it to your procurement teams or your legal teams or IRBs even, so they can see exactly, exactly what you're going to do, and that you know what you're doing and you know how to do it safely, and it's going to help shorten your enrollment timeline, which of course is the number one goal that we're all striving to do.
And stick with it, right?
Yeah.
So many times people kind of like start something and then they're like, it's not working, we got to try something else. Like it's like, just breathe, give it time to grow, and give it time to reach the people it needs, and start to look at the little bit, the data you do see coming in. Are patients falling out? Where are they falling out at? What's not? And tweak as you need to, but you have to buy into it, and you have to really commit and stick with it to give it the opportunity to grow and to do what it needs to do.
Persistence and breathing. These are two important things. I want to be mindful of time, but there's one other important issue I want us to sort of tie a bow on this discussion, which has been incredibly enjoyable for me, and I hope everyone that is listening in. I'd like everyone to sort of look at your crystal balls for a moment and contemplate, use the totality of your experience and talents. And Steph, let me start with you in terms of what do you think that we can expect to see in the relative near-term horizon? I don't want to go too far out because things obviously can change rapidly, as we've all seen, but maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, from a patient recruitment, trends, outcomes, methodologies. Well, give me a couple of things that you think we can look for as we look ahead.
So one of the things that I have seen recently getting a bit more traction is this idea around really site networks taking on full risk for enrollment. And what I mean by that is, sites they're not only committing to a set number of patients based on their feasibility that they've done up front, but also placing their compensation, or most of it, tied to an enrolled subject. And I think that's a very forward-thinking mindset, and it's starting to gain traction by all means. But I do think that also brings up another theme or trend that we're starting to see. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, most patient recruitment companies wouldn't necessarily adopt a performance-based milestone pricing model. And I'm seeing now many companies are offering this type of an agreement, which I think, because patient recruitment is becoming more and more predictable with the technologies and approaches that are out there, they're able to share that risk with pharma and biotech companies. So I think that's probably two trends that I can see really, hopefully, taking off in my crystal ball.
I like the sound of that. Renee, what do you think? One or two things you see in the future for patient recruitment?
Yeah, I think, I agree with Stephanie, and I think we as on the pharma side, we're learning, we continue to learn, and we're learning to trust our vendors more and to not hire a vendor to help us with patient recruitment, but then tell them what to do, because then it's like hiring a plumber to fix your electrical work, and it doesn't work. You have to let the subject, the way I term it is the subject matter experts do what they do. Without getting in their way. Be there for the expertise to give them the information they need, but let them run the diagnostics, let them understand the what things need to look like, let them bring the proposals to us, and then we can choose from them and try to stay out of their way. We have a lot more niche vendors that are coming up today that we didn't have 5 years ago. I know Stephanie touched on them, you did, Andrew, and Jessica. We all talked about different things, data mining, all of these different things, and they take time to grow and to build into. But I think that we're going to start to see the benefit of all of those things coming together, along with the decentralization of clinical trials to make it easier on the patients and stuff like that. So I really think that although we've always felt as if, and when I say we, I mean me, felt as if I was patient-centric, I don't know that I was always as patient-centric as I should have been. I was thinking more about my timelines, my milestones, and things like that. Now it's things like, we will find patients and we'll bring them in-house and we'll have conversations with them and talk to them, and they'll give discussions with the people on the teams to help them understand what these patients are going through as we start to look at different ideas on the patient recruitment. So I definitely think IT and internet and stuff is the way of the future. I definitely think pulling in different vendors and learning how to work together better and sharing information better. I think pharma companies are getting better at working together to help to get to the right patients in the right protocols and not just checking a box at the end of the day.
Jess, real quick, future state?
Yeah, I bet everyone knows what I'm going to say, but I do think that the social and digital channels are just going to continue to grow, and not just because it's what I do all day, but I think COVID, if nothing else, really taught us that we can do a lot of the things digitally that we had been doing in person, and there are pros and cons to losing that personal interaction. I totally get it, but I think it's a really good opportunity for companies to start to interact with people digitally, and the targeting capabilities that we have on social media to get very granular. We always joke internally that it's almost creepy how much information I can see on the back end of a social channel about someone, but that allows us to feed them information that's going to help them make a better informed decision about their health. So using that granular targeting to execute paid search campaigns and paid ad campaigns across a variety of social channels, I think is really going to become extra important as we're not able to do, one-on-one visits or public gatherings for any kind of live presentation. People are going to be turning even more so to digital and social.
Makes sense. So thank you all for that. I know our time is short, but I want to get to a question that's been posed to the group. Let me share it real quick. The question is, how do plan sponsors interact with physicians who have identified/gathered patients suffering from rare diseases? Do they pay for patients recruited into trials for data? do they interact in some other way? Steph, if you could take a crack at that.
Sure, absolutely. So, really, we rely on the sites to really work within their community to set up any referral networks or avenues. The other way it could be done is if we've engaged an advocacy group, but typically at the sponsor level, we really rely on the sites to really have that relationship or to initiate that process. I don't know, Renee, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, as the pharmaceutical company, we'll interact with the investigators and provide them with the information around the study and what it looks like. And if those investigators feel as if they have a patient demographic, like I think, Andrew, the example was orphan disease?
Yeah, rare diseases.
Rare diseases, yeah. So if that's the case, we'll know, we hope to know where to find these investigators or these physicians who have these patient populations. We'll reach out to them with a feasibility questionnaire and a study synopsis that they look at, and then we go through. There is a contracting process. The investigators get reimbursed for their participation in the study. The patients get reimbursed for their time that they spend in the study, and it's all IRB approved, et cetera. So they do get compensated for the work that they do. And that's all handled prior to the first patient entering into the study in any of the countries.
Yeah, that's right. Pharma's always looking for more touch points with more investigators, especially in rare diseases, because there's sort of a finite amount of potential investigators that can be involved. So yes, there's a compensatory component to that that's negotiated in the clinical trial agreement. But I know that what sponsors crave are more best-in-class investigators, because that's a whole other panel that we could have on the shortage of investigators involved with clinical studies. But unfortunately, our time has come to a close. I'd like to thank everyone that joined us for this discussion. I hope you enjoyed it half as much as I did, and I enjoyed it immensely. I want to thank Renee Creo from Bayer, Stephanie Kuhner from Bristol Myers Squibb, and of course, Jessica Snyder from LifeSci Communications. Again, I'm Andrew Aramondo from LifeSci Communications. I hope you enjoyed the panel, and thank you very much once again for spending some time with us late on a Tuesday.
Thanks, Andrew, for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone.